Hello everyone, Ember Power here, and welcome back to a new video. In this one, I'd like to take a look as to why Standard can feel pretty repetitive and boring a lot of the time, despite the variety in the Standard format. So, as we know it, Standard has plenty of decks that are viable and plenty of decks that can see play, but when you're playing on the standard ladder, be it ranked or casual, you might find yourself up against the same few decks. For me, it's definitely been Chien-Pao, Charizard, and Lost Box. I'm sure it's a little bit different for every player, especially depending on what rank you're at. But you will find that you're basically playing against the same few decks, and I think some new players, maybe, like mainly newer players really, are probably wondering, why this is and how maybe you can best approach this, how you can deal with it and basically why I think this will actually change with a new set that's coming out and with the new era of cards. So basically, with TCGO, so we do have to actually backtrack a bit to the previous client. With TCGO, if you ever got a bit bored of standard, then you could just select one of the other formats, be it theme or expanded, or even I guess legacy if you could find an opponent, because legacy was of course super niche at the time, even then. But as you can tell, there was many other options for, different formats. However, when we got onto TCG Live, we quickly realized there would only be standard, because let's face it, ranked and casual is basically the same thing. And there would also be 1/3 of expanded added to standard. So expanded is made up of the standard card pool plus, the expanded sets. However, TCG Live expanded is only made up of Sun and Moon, not X and Y and Black and White. So that's what we had on TCGO, and then that's what we have now on TCG Live. We just have less formats and thus less things to do, and basically things can feel very repetitive very quickly. So that's kind of one of the reasons why this has become more of a problem right now, I guess, but not necessarily the main reason why you face the same decks every day and the same decks all the time. So basically, TCG Live introduced this rather cool new feature, which basically gives you a free new deck with every set. 2 free decks if you fork out the crystals for them. So I'm trying to desperately save up some extra crystals for when Paradox Rift eventually drops. But basically, you get 2 free decks with every new battle pass, which is a great way of getting players into the game, especially, players who just want to build up a collection and basically try out a new deck without having to spend, loads of credits. So what it does mean, however, though, is that a lot of players end up playing that deck. So for example, the Chien-Pao deck was a deck that you could easily upgrade into a very competitive deck. And we also saw this with the Charizard in Obsidian Flames. Now I'd like to start off with Chien-Pao, so we'll start off with Paldea Evolved, because I think this was the first time that I really noticed this kind of like repetitive standard. So with Scarlet Violet base set, there was this like a lot of hype around the new X Pokemon. For the first few days of Scarlet and Violet, I was facing a lot of different decks. There was like Arcanine, there was Miraidon, there was Koraidon, there was like all these new EX Pokemon like Magenzone, even Lucario was seeing some experimentation. A lot of cool new decks. But with Paldea Evolved, it became very apparent very quickly there would only really be one true survivor of the set. Two, I guess, if you count Ting Lu to some extent, but to be fair, Ting Lu hasn't really done a whole lot really outside of some niche event play, so I feel a bit bad for Ting Lu, but in all honesty, the big winner from Paldea Evolved was certainly Chien-Pao. And Chien-Pao is a free deck, and Chien-Pao is also a great deck. Now, leading up to the release of Paldea Evolved, many people speculated there would be cool decks to be had from stuff like Quaxalava, Skeledirge, and Meowscarada, so the main starter trio that all had EX cards. And all those cards are very cool, but sadly, they didn't really end up seeing much play, let alone experimentation, because sadly, on the first few days of Paldea Evolved's release online, Chien-Pao was basically the only deck that I was playing against. I'd like to know what other people were playing against at the time, if you can remember, like you can cast your minds back to that time. Do you remember what you were playing against on the first few days? Was it just Chien-Pao? Was it other stuff as well? But for me, it was very common to face up to 4 Chien-Paos in a row before facing anything else. So very bloated, very overpopulated. I basically gave up on standard briefly at that point and just kind of moved to different content as well as focusing on other stuff in real life. But basically, Chien-Pao definitely took the fight out of me for Paldea Evolved. I don't hate the deck. I think it's a perfectly well balanced deck. But at the same time, it was the most played deck for sure in the Paldea Evolved format. And then Obsidian Flames came around, and it was basically Paldea Evolved situation, but 10 times worse. Because as everyone knows, basically by this point, Obsidian Flames was a pretty awful set, to say the least. It was made up of a bunch of bulk starter decks that were going to release in Japan, and rather than do the noble thing and just release them in the West as starter decks, they combined them to make up our big set, Obsidian Flames, with one main set, Ruler of the Black Flame. And unfortunately, Ruler of the Black Flame didn't contain that many good cards to begin with anyway. Basically, the only good card from Ruler of the Black Flame, and the main card from Obsidian Flames, was this Charizard. That was it. That was literally it. There were several other decks that were kind of hyped up at the time. I remember people talking about how like Tyranitar might be pretty good, and I was definitely on that hype train, to say the least. I definitely still believe Tyranitar could maybe be good in the future, but still, it's a fairly weak card. Also saw some YouTubers, hyping up Toadsquirrel and Vespiquen. They ultimately didn't do very much, if nothing at all. So yeah, the set ended up having a lot of duds, and Charizard being a free deck definitely didn't help that, and also being a really easy deck to play just meant that a lot of people turned to Charizard. It's also a winning deck. This deck has done really well in recent online events and recent IRL tournaments, so it stands to reason that a lot of players will be picking this up. And it stands to reason why, you see this deck so much on TCG Live now, both in Standard and Expanded. But we also have the other big offender in the format, which is going to be Lost Zone. I'm not going to use this video to basically explain my thoughts on Lost Zone, but it is a pretty popular deck. Now, what you will notice with a lot of Lost Zone players online, though, is that they kind of play slow at the start, kind of hoping that you'll concede, I think, after doing a few flower selectings. But if you do play out the game, you do realize that quite a lot of players don't really know what they're doing with Lost Box. I feel like I can comfortably say that because I really don't know what I'm doing with Lost Box half the time anyway. I kind of just make it up as I go along, and somehow I get victories out of it. But, most players don't really know what they're doing with this deck, so it is kind of easy to beat most of the time. Obviously, not every time. You will face players who actually know what they're doing, and they'll give you a good challenge. But basically, this deck is also really popular because, it can generate quick concedes from people who don't want to play against Sableye and, sit through all the flower selectings, but just something worth bearing in mind. But basically, what I want to do now is actually just bring up the fact that we are very quickly approaching our next set, which is Paradox Rift. And Paradox Rift, as it stands, is probably going to be an amazing set for the Pokemon TCG. It basically features so many playable and unique cards, such as the Garchomp EX, Goldengo, Skeledirge, Mewtwo, Roaring Moon, Iron Valiant. I can go on all day listing powerful cards that will definitely be viable decks. So we're basically not just going to end up with one Chien-Pao or one Charizard. Hopefully we're going to end up with all these amazing new decks that will see experimentation and will see play on the ladder. And yeah, that's kind of all I have to say about that, really. I think it is a bit boring right now, but I do think it will get better. Hopefully we never get to the point again where it's just one deck comes out of a set and that's the only thing that sees play online. And of course, I do hope that we get the full expanded at some point on TCG Live. If we do get the GLC format added, I think that'd be really cool. Even though I do have some issues with GLC, I think it's overall a really solid format and would be a great addition to TCG Live. But yeah, this has been Aaron Power. Let me know what your thoughts on this matter are down below. And yeah, as always, thank you for watching.